All right, good evening, everybody. It's Steve with Real Progressives. Super excited to have our friend Rohan Grey back from the Modern Money Network. But before we bring Rohan on, I would just want to state, folks, we got some big stuff coming up here in the future. We got a lot of really important stuff going on. Beginning of September, I believe it's 8th through the 10th, the Convergence Conference. You're going to have people like Shama Sawant. You're going to have a slew of people. Lee Camp will be there. Chase Iron Eyes will be there. Many other really, really incredible speakers will be there. Cornell West is the keynote. I'll be doing a roundtable. I believe I'll be doing a work session as well. But also, towards the end of the next month, will also be the Modern Monetary Theory worldwide, whatever you want to call it, big, huge conference in UMKC, Kansas City. And we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight as well. What the primary thing that for tonight's discussion, and this is something that everybody needs to be very aware of, and that is the debt ceiling. We're about to have another debt ceiling showdown, and we're going to help you understand what the theater is and what the reality is. So without further ado, let me bring on my guest, Rohan Grey. Welcome to the show, sir.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. So you were kind enough to go to the Democracy Convention in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where you were on a panel with public banking and the American Monetary Institute discussing monetary reform, monetary theory, and basically how to bring forth a progressive agenda. Talk a little bit about how that went down, sir.
Yeah, well, it was a good experience, and I had a lot of fun interacting with the other participants, and I thought that overall the conference was the part that I participated in was well organized, and it was nice to be able to interact with people from different camps in a respectful way, and the format was there was an initial panel for representatives of the Public Banking Institute, the American Monetary Institute, and my organization, the Modern Money Network, representing the sort of MMT community. And subsequently, there was a hour and a half long workshop for people who are interested in exploring the MMT ideas in more depth. So it was a sort of like try before you buy panel to start with, and then people chose the one that they wanted to go to. So my workshop, I'll go backwards to the main talk, but my workshop was called The Only Comprehensive Framework for Progressive Economic Reform. So what I was making the case was to sort of differentiate, because that was the aim of that panel and workshop combination. MMT was to say that while we think that progressive monetary reform is important, and we also think that financial reform, and in particular the development of public banking alternatives to the existing banking system is important, that it's important to have even more important to have a framework that provides you with a kind of lens that you can look at a range of different monetary and economic issues, rather than starting with a solution and then sort of defining the problem so that that is only the solution. So we've worked in the past with people from the Public Banking Institute, and they're doing really great work around the country in the United States, working on developing public banking options and alternatives in a range of different contexts, from the local to the state level, and just in general raising awareness about the idea of public banking. And the American Monetary Institute is sort of in a different vein of monetary reform. They have a global community or network of different institutions that pursue a similar approach, and while there are certainly areas of overlap, and broadly speaking, a kind of shared recognition that these are important topics, the MMT community differs with them significantly in certain areas. So it was valuable to be able to, in a sort of friendly, respectful way, keep grounded in the fact that we're all here because we all want to change, society for the better, and that we recognize money is important, but also being able to highlight those differences and let people hear where MMT distinguishes itself from the the AMI slash positive money slash global monetary reform kind of view of what needs to be done and what the problems are.
So, with that in mind, let me ask you this question because I've had my own experiences presenting before the Green Party. I personally found there's a healthy split in there. In fact, there's a bit of a rebellion within the Green Party right now. Folks in New Jersey, folks in Nebraska, folks in various areas within the Green Party, Chicago, you name it, have been pushing to literally get rid of their Section M of their platform, which basically talks about how the single greatest threat to America is the debt. Sound very GOP-ish. And they were also referencing basically that, we can't really do anything that we want to do until we green the dollar, end the Fed, do this, do that, and all the other. And the people that have perked up to modern monetary theory are really quite fascinated with the idea that rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, we can do a lot of things today. Of course, we can always elaborate and make things better as we go. But the point is that we don't have to put the brakes on saving lives today. And I think that that's speaking to a lot of Green Party people, a lot of progressives in general, who actually want to see a massive progressive agenda, not nibbling around the edges anymore. Can you talk a little bit about what your experience is in general with the idea of a robust progressive agenda and the barriers mentally, the mental barriers that we're having with actually approaching big ideas versus nibbling around the edges?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say about that is that one of the things that I think that MMT brings to the table, and I mentioned this in my talk there, which is recorded online, so if people are interested, they can listen to it, is that implicit or perhaps more subtle, but also in MMT, is a kind of theory of political change, via these ideas, in the sense that the reason that it chooses to emphasize certain things over others is because it has determined that those are things that are politically valuable to emphasize. And the reason that's important is because one of the things that I think MMT acknowledges in a way that a lot of progressive oriented people that don't necessarily come to it from the same breadth of experience or insider access is the idea that making political change takes real political capital and takes real political effort. And as a result, you want to be really careful with what you're pushing as your first priorities, because if you push forward something that isn't the biggest problem or isn't the main heart of the problem, even if it may be something that's sort of worth doing at some point, and then you run out of energy or something goes wrong with that, you can destroy the chances to making further change or to implementing the rest of your agenda. So there is a difference between starting from a kind of ideal, what do we want in this perfect world, versus what is the right thing to push for as the next big change or the next big push. So one of the things that you learn, or at least in my experience coming from a lawyer's background, is that things that can be achieved with scalpels are often better than things that can be achieved with large blunt hammers if the effect is ultimately the same. Now, you have to be careful about that in the sense that you don't want to not achieve what you want to achieve, or you don't want to mislead something or leave a problem unaddressed. But when it comes to things that achieve the same outcome, or more importantly, achieve interim outcomes that gives you the power to build on further, then the question becomes sort of, if you have one bullet in your chamber, what do you choose to focus on? And in that respect, one of the things that MMT talks about is this idea that in a contemporary economic system like the US, where you have a floating non-convertible fiat currency, the difference between a government debt instrument and a government monetary instrument is from the perspective of the concerns that most progressives have, is not that one is debt and one is money, but it's that one earns interest and the other doesn't earn interest. So when most people say debt, they think of two things. They think, firstly, you have to repay it in something that you don't already own. So when you and I have a debt to the bank, one of the reasons that's a problem is because the thing that we have to pay the bank is not something that we have ready access to in infinite quantities. Compare that to US debt, where the only thing it promises to give you is US money. And so what that means is if you hold, as the old joke goes, 10 British pounds and you take it to the Bank of England or to the Treasury, you might get two £5 notes back. If you take £10 of debt, you may get two £5 notes back. So the idea that debt has to be repaid is another way of saying debt is convertible into money or into another form of government money. The other thing that we think about when we think about debt is the idea that we have to pay interest because we are borrowing something or we are accessing credit that we otherwise would not have access to. So when people are concerned about the idea that the government is in debt, what they usually are thinking about, like their own balance sheet, is that the government is spending a lot of money paying interest. But what MMT looks at, and one of the reasons why I use that word comprehensive in the talk, is that if you understand the relationship between the Treasury on one hand and the central bank on the other, and more particularly between fiscal policy on one hand and monetary policy on the other, it becomes clear that government debt and the interest paid on government debt is a function of monetary policy. That is to say, the reason there is a positive rate paid on government debt is because the central bank wants there to be. And the reason the central bank wants there to be is because the central bank has a whole intellectual and policy framework based around the idea that the best way to engage in government demand management, aggregate demand management in the sort of broader Keynesian sense, is to adjust interest rates and adjust the so-called price of money rather than to engage in fiscal policy. So the standard narrative around the world is that monetary policy should be used first, and only when you sort of tap out monetary policy should you turn to fiscal policy. And so in their view, it's a good thing that interest rates on government money, that is to say a safe rate, and if you take, corporate law 101, or if you take an MBA class, they'll say assume the treasury rate is the safe rate because there's not an expectation the government's going to default on its own debt. The idea that the safe rate should be positive most of the time is important to monetary policy because then it gives them room to cut that interest rate when they need to. It's sort of like wearing a few extra layers of clothing so that if it gets warm, you can take them off. So they like having a positive interest rate as the default situation because then it gives them space to cut the interest rate if they want to. Now, MMT would say that's a bad framework, that A, it's basically free interest to bondholders, and B, it's misleading and confusing and gives this impression that we are, in inverted commas, borrowing beyond our means. But what MMT would say is that from a functional perspective, there is no difference between the government running a deficit by newly created debt-free money, that is to say, issuing greenbacks or issuing coins or just marking numbers up in an account somewhere, and then on the back end, the central bank paying a positive interest rate to maintain its interest rate policy, the same way as it does now with interest on reserves. So there's no difference between that and the current system of issuing debt. In both situations, the amount of interest paid is something the central bank chooses. So from that perspective, if you say, we've got one thing to fix, we've got one bullet in our gun, and the thing we want to focus on is we want to change the instrument that we finance government with from debt to coins or debt to greenbacks or something. If that's your one bullet and you do that, and then the central banking class, the monetary policy class, say, sure, do that, and we'll just pay interest on reserves, then they are ultimately going to waste that political ammunition and not achieve the things that they want to achieve. So there is a tactical and strategic decision that this is not useful to focus on and that it's not actually where the problem lies. And so that's one of the things that there's disagreement with. And this ties into this broader idea that the Fed is private and that it doesn't make sense to consolidate the Treasury and the Federal Reserve in your analytical thinking because there's so much political capturing of the Fed. And I brought this up at the conference, but it's sort of like saying, well, we think the FCC or the FDA is captured, therefore we're going to treat it like it's outside of the government. It's still a government agency. It's just a matter of it being politically corrupt. And so what you want to deal with is the fact that it's politically corrupt and not pretend like it's private when it's not. So that's the kind of bigger conceptual difference that leads to this tactical and strategic difference.
So we have a question from one of our faithful, Tom Pittman. He says, can someone confirm for me the money held in a reserve current account earns the Fed base rate, i.e. 0.25%?
I believe it's higher now. I believe they've raised it to something like 1.25%. But it's not the money held in a reserve account. It's the money held excess of the required reserves. So that would be the interest on excess reserves, because the required reserves are going to be held as reserves either way. They're going to be held as reserves because they legally have to be. The question is, what do you do with all of the excess liquidity that the bank or the banking system ends up holding? And the answer is you can either hold it as excess reserves and earn interest on it paid directly by the central bank, or you can hold it as treasury debt and earn interest paid directly by the treasury. And from the MMT perspective, those two are largely a wash. They're largely the same. And so what's important from the MMT perspective is not debt-free money, but zero interest rates, which means that the fight isn't with the coinage people or the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. The fight is with the entire political and conceptual edifice that says that monetary policy is the first and foremost thing that should be used to deal with macroeconomic policy. And to simply say we want to shut down the Fed because it's privatized or move it into Treasury does not fix that problem. It does not fix the fact that the conventional wisdom across the entire government system, across the entire economics discipline, is that monetary policy is the best first tool. It is simply not true that you can just hand wave away the fact that the entire bureaucracy of the Treasury and the Fed and every economics, every macroeconomist in every major place, really, except for the heterodox people like the post-Keynesians and the MMTers, believe this other thing, and you can just change it overnight. If you tried to eliminate this overnight, you would have thousands of people getting up and going to work every day who still believe the prior regime and don't have a new narrative. And if you just say, we're going to have basic fiscal policy, then they are going to say, we already had this conversation back in the 1960s and we've moved past it. You haven't actually answered the objections that led to the contemporary monetary policy regime. So as sort of arcane and nerdy as it sounds, one of the reasons that MMT ends up focusing on the things that it does is because it has a very sensitive and astute interpretation of the political landscape and the particular institutions and communities that have to be tackled head on if we're actually going to change the policy regime in a way that uses the one kind of bullet or the one big public push effectively. Because in my view, and I think that this is the MMT's view generally, we don't get a chance to redo this. We don't get a chance to say, whoops, we made a mistake, let's try again. If you screw this up, that's another 20 or 30 years before we're going to have another monetary reform commission. That's another 20 or 30 years before anyone's going to trust the progressives or the left with control over economic policy making. So it's very important to make sure that you have a framework that has the ability to answer new problems as they come up, not just, well, let me go back to that one problem that I really like talking about.
Okay. So this brings me to something that I talked to you a little bit about on the phone earlier, but I'd like our audience to hear this because it's very important to me that people understand, and I'm not saying this in a way that like is a fanboy here, but we need our heroes, okay? And you call it whatever you want, your guideposts, people that actually know this stuff down to the nth degree and who are able to be, I'm going to put this graphic up here just for grins and giggles. This right here, we made this earlier today that, it was going to originally say like MMT up there on the sign. But we do need our heroes, and we need people that we can look up to and that we can count on in lieu of being experts ourselves. I know a lot compared to the average person, but when I sit around you, I feel like a complete and utter imbecile. And I say that self-deprecating in a joking fashion, but it is quite true. Your depth of knowledge is so incredible that I wish that I could have you, a little ventriloquist act where I could get you to throw your voice from New York down here to Pennsylvania so I could always have you on tap. Because honest to God, there is a scourge within the progressive community hell-bent on doing things that are disastrous, ignorant, sideline the movement away from actually moving forward. And I, for one, have a tremendously unbelievable, deep passion for saving lives, having experienced what it's like to be on the wrong side of a downturn economy. I feel like incredibly helpless and powerless at times. But when I hear someone like you, Rohan, one of the things that I told you about earlier is you are absolutely able to tip your hat when someone gets something right, but then you're able to guide them to the right answer. I'm the guy that breaks out the sledgehammer because I just don't have as much of the depth that you do, but I'm also dealing from a different point. I'm trying to save lives. You're a technician who has the same goals, but you have such a depth. How can people, regular people that are activating in this manner, how can they capture enough information to be effective and at the same time be able to know when they've hit their break point to hand off and push away to someone with a deeper knowledge level? Because the stakes are so high right now, Rohan.
Yeah. So, I think the answer to the second question for me is this question about, the each one teach one philosophy that you've been espousing that I'm deeply supportive of. I was a teacher in a daycare center for infants and at a K-12 school and in various forms of adult education over the last few years. I strongly believe that the ability to teach something is a good indication of how well you've learned it. So rather than sort of getting up on a soapbox and trying to teach a whole class in day one, one way to practice your understanding of these ideas is to try and communicate them to people in your life or in your community. Obviously, hopefully without threatening your relationship or alienating your kids or pissing off all of your friends, as some of us have been known to do. But the idea of assessing how well you can explain these ideas that you think you've understood when you have to explain them to a complete layperson. In terms of finding the information out there, first thing is that one of the reasons that I set up the Modern Money Network, not a foundation, not an institute, but a network, is because I strongly believe that there are sources of information and knowledge and insight around the world that cannot be kind of put on a hierarchy where just one person is more valuable than another. Just to give an example from my profession in law, there are whole areas that I know nothing about. And if somebody came to me with a legal problem, the best thing that I could do would be to refer them to somebody I know that is good. That would be the most professionally ethical thing that I could do. Not to say, I can take this, I can run with it. Oh, you've got a complicated murder trial in Louisiana? Yeah, sure, I've got that. Let me take it. You've got a complicated multi-state commercial arbitration issue. Yeah, sure, I've got that. I was a family lawyer. That was my focus. I worked on copyright. That's my interest. But I'm not doing litigation in Louisiana for criminal defense, and I'm not doing complex commercial arbitration. So the thing that I should know, in addition to my own area, is who's doing the good work, which means knowing about people. I forget which order Eleanor Roosevelt had. She sort of said something like great minds discuss, I forget if it's ideas or people at the top, but whatever it is, I'm a strong believer that ideas are filtered through people, and people hold insight and information and knowledge. And the best thing that we can do for the progressive movement is build a stronger network and community between us. So what our organization tries to do is find the various people that are describing in their own ways the different parts of the elephant that need specialist technical insight, whether that's legal or economic or financial or accounting or historical, and provide that information and connections to the broader kind of icebergs underneath those snippets of the initial insights, and provide them in a space where people can access. So organizing information and presenting it in an accessible way is something that people can do to help, and finding the things that they think are useful, because chances are if you as a layperson are struggling with a particular issue, so are other people. And we try to make ourselves as available as possible. Obviously, we're all taking up our time doing different things. There are certain kinds of insider conversations, and there are certain kinds of research that needs to be done by people with certain kinds of access and knowledge. But the aim is, as much as possible, to build the community's general competence, to find the people that are interested in those special areas and give them support and transfer that information as much as possible, and to build a network so that people know who to go for specialized information. That said, there are a lot of conversations that you can have and things you can contribute to without needing to know the details, the really, really fine, gritty details. It's just a matter of being cognizant of your own limitations and not thinking that what you've read up until today is sufficient to know everything about that topic. So in addition to being a network, we called ourselves a learning organization because we're constantly trying to learn. We're not here with a single book that is the Bible, that is the truth. Even the MMT community is an evolving learning project, and the way that they talk about their earlier inspirations for ideas, and we got these ideas for these people and these ideas for these people, and then we've added our own, and then we've moved into these new areas and we've tried to talk about new things. It's an adaptive community, not one that is merely static. Now, the fact that certain ideas and certain claims are foundational is because those are claims that are sort of inductively based over thousands of years of history that they've researched and incorporated. If it turns out aliens invade, or if it turns out that there's some whole new community that's never been discovered where things work fundamentally differently, then the theory will update itself. But the idea is not that there is a sort of fixed static body of knowledge that only certain people have access to. It's that we're all trying to learn as much as we can together, and that there are certain people that are going to be better placed to learn certain things than others. And rather than everybody try and learn everything, the best thing that we can do is support each other, finding our best selves, and then make sure we're all available to each other, and that our research and our findings and our ideas are shared with each other in the clearest, most accessible ways possible. So
that's beautiful. One of the issues that we're primed up for the night was the debt ceiling that's coming up. And throughout recent history, we've been riddled with these fiscal cliffs, debt ceilings. There's a lot of interesting stuff about minting the coin. Joe Firestone recently talked about that.
Yeah.
You talked extensively about that. Do me a favor and just take us baby steps to the beginning of what debt is and why this debt ceiling exists, the history of it, and why we're about to face it yet again.
Okay, so the basic thing to start with, which is a sort of basic arithmetic idea, is the idea that, putting aside the MMT point that taxes don't fund spending, if you have three things, you have a certain amount you're allowed to tax and a certain amount you're supposed to spend, what you're going to have is something which is the difference. That difference may be zero. If you're required to spend $1 million and you're going to get $1 million in taxes, the difference may be zero. If you're required to spend $1 million and you're going to get $2 million in taxes or other forms of revenue, then the difference may be minus $1 million or $1 million in one direction. And if you are required to spend $1 million, but you're only going to get 500,000 back in taxes, then you have a difference of 500,000. So the question of what you do to, so to speak, finance that difference becomes very relevant for public budget policy. Now, when I say finance, I don't mean pay for in the sense that, you need to get it from somewhere else. My point is that financing is another way of saying the thing that you issue to record that deficit. So you could finance a deficit with newly created money, or you could finance a deficit with previously created money that you claim back. Now, that's not because taxes fund spending, because the money to pay taxes had to come from prior spending. It's that a certain amount of your budget this year is basically accounted for by the tax revenue that you've taken in that year. And so when it comes to the question of what new instruments to issue, you don't have to worry about that part of your budget. If you have to spend $1 million and you're getting in 500,000 in taxes, those 500,000 in taxes are going to be, so to speak, financed by the 500,000 that you got in taxes. And I repeat, this is not inconsistent with the MMT idea that taxes don't fund spending. This is just saying that when you've created money out of thin air and injected it into the economy, then you don't have to recreate and re-inject that money. You could. One way to do that with the physical notes, as Warren Mosler says, is you could take the physical notes and rip them up and issue a brand new bunch of physical notes. So you can do it that way. Digitally, when you're talking about accounting entries, you don't have to. But the point I wanted to make is that the 500,000 that can be sort of offset against your tax revenue is treated differently to the other 500,000. And the question is, what do you do with that other 500,000? And historically, because most people don't understand that money is created by the government and they think that taxes do fund spending, they think that you got the 500,000 from your taxes and that was money that existed somewhere out there in the world, and now you've sort of captured it, but now you don't have another 500,000 to cover the other bit, so you're screwed. And so what they say is the only thing you can do in that situation is borrow it. Like you and I would have to borrow it from a friend or from a bank. You have to sort of go hat in hand begging somebody. And so in their mind, you have two options. One is you can tax for the money, and two is you can borrow the money. What they omit from that discussion, and I'll get back to this in a second, is the third option, which is you can create more money. So if you have a choice as a government between you have $1 million you have to spend, say on healthcare or social security, one way to cover that $100 million is to have tax revenue. Another way to cover it is by issuing treasury bonds. And another way to cover it is by issuing newly created coins and notes. These all have different treatments legally. And so what the debt ceiling was, once upon a time, was a way of saying every time, let me rephrase. Before the debt ceiling, every time you wanted to spend on a new bill, so a new hospital bill or a new war bill or something, you would issue debt or new kinds of treasury instruments specifically to finance that program. So you would say, and it could be taxes as well. So you would say, okay, we're going to have a new program for, school lunches, and we're going to finance it with a tax on X, and the rest that doesn't get covered by that tax will finance by the issue of debt, and we're going to issue, up to a certain amount of treasury securities to finance that. In World War I, or at the beginning of World War I, they said, this is too complicated. There's 100 different individual sort of credit cards floating around for different programs. What's much easier is if we consolidate them all into one, and then that'll actually give the government more discretion to take money that was allocated to one program that they didn't end up spending and use it for another program. So the original debt ceiling was an attempt to make it easier for the government to spend along different programs. What happened over time was that debt ceiling became a limit that you had to extend. So every time you wanted to spend more, you would be expanding the debt ceiling. Again, this was because money creation or just direct monetary financing of deficits wasn't something that people wanted to talk about. So what you had over a period of time was that the debt ceiling, the number, became synonymous with the amount of government spending that can be done in excess of taxes. And that was a useful game for both sides of the political aisle. Every time they got close to the debt ceiling, there would be umming and ahhing, and then one side would hold out and the other side would push, and there would be this whole big theater. And then they would always pass the debt ceiling. Sometimes for a long period of time, it wasn't even controversial. But even after it became controversial, they would still pass it. It was only in recent years that they started sort of going scorched earth and saying we won't pass it under any circumstances, in part to do with the rise of the Tea Party. And so when you had that situation and they said we're not going to pass it under any circumstances, then, or without huge agreements to cut spending and things, then you started facing this question of what happens if we hit the debt ceiling? And you had this big amount of people, big sort of outpour of ideas and talking heads with all these different ideas. And one lawyer, just a sort of private practicing commercial lawyer, who had been frequenting Warren Mosler's blog, so he's clearly, done his MMT homework and knew where to look, knew where to find the pressure point, said, hey, I found this sort of obscure law that says that the Treasury Secretary can mint a coin of whatever denomination it wants. So if we're going to hit the debt ceiling, couldn't we just mint a really big coin and the mint would get the money and the mint could sort of transfer it to the Treasury's account and the Treasury would have that money and then we wouldn't hit the debt ceiling? And the more he pushed that idea and the more people kind of tried to prod it and poke it, it became harder and harder to find a problem with it. And so I actually ended up doing my big legal major writing credit at law school on this exact question about the debt ceiling and what borrowing means for an entity like the US government. And one of the points that I raised was that if you look at the debt ceiling not as a limit on spending, not even as a limit on borrowing, but as a limit on the issuance of certain kinds of treasury securities, then you can actually analogize that to the current limit on the issuance of US notes, what we now think of as greenbacks. Because greenbacks, which look identical to Federal Reserve notes, the cash in our pocket, but they're issued by US Treasury, are legally on the books as being able to be created up to $300 million by the US Treasury Secretary. There's nothing stopping the US Treasury Secretary right now telling the Bureau of Engraving and Printing to print $300 million worth of greenbacks. And that wouldn't be added to the debt ceiling, and that wouldn't be considered debt in the way that we normally think about it, even though it would be acceptable in payment of taxes. And so my point was that could be considered a greenback ceiling. And the debt ceiling is a way of is a ceiling for another kind of instrument. The reason we think of it as a debt ceiling, to go back to that earlier conversation about AMI, is that Treasury securities historically paid interest. So we think of it as debt because we think of it as this thing that is paying interest and we have to pay it back. Whereas a US note, a greenback, doesn't have any interest attached to it. So it's clearly not debt to us. Even though, of course, if you got paid with greenbacks and you put the greenbacks in the bank, the central bank would start paying that bank interest. So it would be interest earning anyway, and eventually. But my point about the debt ceiling was, when you think about it like this, then the question is there a limit on every kind of instrument the government could issue to finance its deficit? And what the platinum coin loophole, the $1 trillion coin loophole, found was the answer is no. When it comes to coins, you can issue as many coins as you want. There is no limit on the quantitative amount of coins that can be issued by the Treasury. But what there is limits on the denominations of those coins and the content of them. So say you can issue as many quarters as you want, but the quarters have to be full of 21 cents worth of metal, and it takes another 2 cents to make them. You're only making a, so to speak, seigniorage profit of 2 cents on every quarter. So if you had to finance the whole government where you only got 2 cents worth of spending power every time you issued a coin, you'd be issuing a hell of a lot of coins to finance the ongoing government deficit. So theoretically, you could finance the whole government by minting quarters. Practically, it couldn't work. Now, you could find another kind of coin, like a $25 palladium commemorative coin. But palladium's expensive. So again, you're talking like $20 worth of palladium going into a $25 coin. So you're not making a seigniorage profit that you can then spend as a deficit enough to finance it. Now compare that with this platinum coin loophole. What it said was, unlike all the other parts of the statute in the Coinage Act, unlike all of them, when it comes to this one kind of platinum coin, the Treasury Secretary can put whatever face value it wants, but the amount of platinum stays the same. So when it came up in the media, there were all these crazy jokes about rolling a huge, 10-foot platinum coin, and it would take as much platinum as exists on the moon, or something, the size of the moon, all these kinds of ridiculous things. But it was all silly and wrong. The coin can be the size of a regular platinum coin, but it can have any number on the face of it from $1 to, $100 trillion. And so when you have a coin that costs $50 to make, and you can choose what number it's worth, you can make that number big enough to cover your entire deficit. So the point about the debt ceiling was that people were framing it like the only choices available were don't spend as much, tax more, or break the debt ceiling. And my point was, and others' point like Joe Firestone and Beowulf, was if you look at all of the different kinds of instruments you can use to, so to speak, finance the deficit, even though there are restrictions quantitatively on the number of treasury securities you can issue, there are not restrictions on the number of coins you can issue. And as a result of that, this three-pronged problem is there's actually a fourth prong that you're not considering. And that fourth prong resolves the problem. So instead of issuing treasury securities, you issue coins and finance the deficit that way, and you don't hit the debt ceiling. Of course, if you're the kind of person that believes there's a huge metaphysical distinction between money and debt, then this may be a big problem for you because you've gone from borrowing the money to printing the money, and you think that might be inflationary or whatever. But if you're the kind of person that understands MMT and you understand that government debt is just another form of money, then you're not going to be worried, because in the same way that quantitative easing was just an asset swap, it sucked out government debt and it added in reserves, then whether or not you finance a deficit by issuing money or you finance a deficit by issuing treasury securities, the net effect is largely the same, provided the interest rate is the same on both of them. I'm sorry, that was very technical. Hopefully that wasn't sort of...
No. What's great for those who watch Joe Firestone on Saturday nights, Joe has gone to great pain in trying to explain seigniorage and going through that process and talked about it. So this is just validity, adding more and more and more validity to various potential ways of approaching these problems. I have something that I want to ask you about real quick. And this is a tweet storm that Stephanie, Dr. Kelton, put out. And it's something I think that you've probably seen before, but I'll go ahead and read it to you, and I'll put it up on the screen for everybody to look at real quickly. Basically, what she said was Democrats keep trying to I'm sorry, it's so small on my screen. Democrats should resist the urge to oppose whatever tax proposal is coming down the pike on the grounds that it will blow up the deficit. And she just kind of goes through this whole rigmarole of basically telling folks that we don't have to find money, that we don't have to dig up money, that we don't have to lay the tombstones of the progressive agenda at the feet of millionaires, that we can basically handle this stuff. And can you talk a little bit about why she's saying that millionaires are not required and billionaires are not required for us to fund the entire progressive agenda. It seems to be a very fetishized view, romantic view of populism and how we attack the problem. But yet, Dr. Kelton said it was not only cruel and unwise to take that approach. I think some people kind of rolled their eyes. They didn't know what to make of it. But to me, it was like, yes, thank you for doing this so much. I appreciate it so much. This is wonderful. Can you kind of elaborate on that, given what you've talked about with the debt ceiling and her perspective on how we don't have to do that?
Yeah, well, if you notice what I was just talking about, even as I was talking about different ways of financing the deficit, and I was talking about issuing government debt, I wasn't at any point talking about taxing people more, and I wasn't talking about borrowing money from anybody that otherwise would have less money. So nothing about what I was just talking about, all those different ways you can finance the deficit, none of them involved other people necessarily. So the whole point was these are different ways the government can choose to finance itself within its own suite of tools. What you have amongst progressives often is, I would call it a kind of shortcut that comes back to bite you in the ass, to use a crude vernacular, because progressives have two goals often in economics. One is to finance things that they want to spend on, and another is to tax the rich because they're too damn rich. And they think that political inequality follows from economic inequality, and that billionaires got that money through unjust ways and things like this. Now, I'm in agreement with basically all of that. I have no interest in defending billionaires, and I think that wealth and income inequality is a massive issue, and I think that there should be massively higher tax rates on the rich. But the problem becomes that progressives often think that the two kind of go together like PB&J. You say, well, I want higher spending on public education, and I also want to tax the rich more, so I'll tell you what, let's advocate that we need to tax the rich to pay for public education. The problem with that is, if you don't win the fight to tax the rich, or if the rich somehow use tax evasion and avoidance to reduce their tax burden, then you've accepted a narrative that there's a scarce pot of money, and consequently, there's less money for you to finance the things that you want to finance. So if you say, yes, we need the rich people's money to finance public spending, in your mind, the important part of that sentence is, we want the rich people's money. But from everybody else's mind, the most important part is to fund things because we need it to fund things. That's the part that they hear. And so I like to think of this as sort of like when somebody has a lover or a partner break up with them, and they're not over it, and they sort of say, I don't even care about that person. They're just an idiot. I don't even like them. But they're the worst person ever. And you sort of look at them and you say, you're not really over this person, are you? You're still kind of hung up on them. Whereas if you were really over them, you'd say, good luck to them. I hope they have a good time. We're going to do this other thing. I'm going to do this other thing with my life. So when it comes to financing public spending, public programs, the MMT point is, you don't need the money from the rich people to ensure that public programs get spent properly. Focusing on the rich in that moment is like being hung up on your ex. It's focusing on the enemy from the prior conversation rather than moving on and focusing on getting on with your life. So the best thing that you can do to reduce the power of the rich and to reduce their spell over people's lives is to render them obsolete. It's to make them irrelevant. It's to build a whole world where they are not necessary. In the same way as the best thing you can do to get over an ex is to just go out and meet other people. If you're constantly feeling like the only way that you can move on with your life is if they're made more miserable, you're going to be stuck defining yourself in relation to them. And that's not to say I think that the rich shouldn't be dealt with. They're their own problem, and we need to deal with the political power in particular that comes from massive wealth inequality. But to focus on them as the source of the money required for public programs is to continue to define public finance solely in relation to private wealth. And that is the wrong way to think about building a progressive society where public money is used for public purpose.
So going back to 1946, one of the famous things MMTers use is Beardsley Rummel's. I guess he's the former New York Fed chair.
He was also the inventor of the pay-go tax system. So yeah, he was very involved in public finance. Yeah.
He wrote or gave a speech, turned into a writing, whatever, in 1946 saying taxes for revenue is obsolete. We've made memes out of his 4 reasons for taxation, and we've used it ad nauseum. Mariner Eccles is another one that we use a lot of, but this is stuff that goes way back. This is not like recent stuff. A lot of the premises by which we're speaking are things that should be well known, but they've been buried under a bunch of mythology and other tales we tell one another to shortcut knowing the truth. But how could something so important as a guy such as Beardsley Rummel saying that taxes for revenue is obsolete, how could it be in 2017 anyone is suggesting to the contrary? And people like literally fighting with us, telling us we're wrong, we're horrible. Of course my Social Security is paid for by that piggy bank I stashed off in the corner of some place the government took, and so on and so forth. This has been a long time coming, and yet here we are stuck, marching in place. J.D. Alt wrote that great article about the oppressive free lunch, and he talked about progressives, the thing that holds us back over and over and over again, because we all basically agree across the board on some pretty basic stuff. The Bernie Sanders platform that was put forward during the primaries, most progressives agree on. So why is it we can't agree to advance that? And really, JD said, because we pump our fists, marching in place feverishly, unable to answer the almighty question of how are you going to pay for it? Real Progressive spends almost every day talking about how you're going to pay for it. You guys are technicians and beautiful, eloquent speakers telling how you're going to pay for it. And going back to 1946, Beardsley Rummel said basically, guys, taxes don't pay for things, man. What's up? Why do we hold on to that? What do you think is the reason for that?
Well, I mean, I think the broader historical point is that there are political forces that benefit from depoliticizing or giving the impression of depoliticizing money. So I'll get back to that in a second, but to answer the specific point about Beardsley Rummel, Rummel was writing right after World War II, but also before the establishment of Bretton Woods. So he was in a kind of moment where the old system had died and the new post-war system hadn't been put in place. So after Bretton Woods was established, there was for a period of time, a fixed exchange rate system until 1971 or 1973, depending on where you want to stop counting. And so from sort of 1940, I think 1949 roughly to 1973, there was a different monetary system that had different constraints. Now, obviously, those could have been changed at any point, and they ultimately were changed. But Rummel's kind of writing comes at a unique moment where there really was a chance to build the kind of monetary system that we have today. And instead, we went down the Bretton Woods system for a period of time and then re-emerged on the other side. So that's one reason why that information was able to be lost, or that those ideas were able to be lost, because they were able to be presented as specific to a particular historical and structural system that has now been rendered obsolete. Another thing is that in the post-war period, there was a lot of consensus that you generally spend more with fiscal policy to make sure you're at full employment or close to it. The problem happened in the 70s when there was a problem that framework could not adequately address. And so when you had the stagflation of the late 70s, the narrative publicly was, you can always manage inflation and demand by the appropriate fiscal levers. When that wasn't working in the late 70s, people jumped on that. People who'd been waiting in the wings for decades jumped on that and said, look, this whole paradigm is discredited. It must have had problems. We need a whole new one. And that paradigm did have problems, but it wasn't the ones that they articulated. And they got into power after that. There was a sort of changing of the guard in the macroeconomics world. And that was a really hard-won fight. the people from the Koch brothers through to Friedrich Hayek were pushing various intellectual agendas in different ways through funding think tanks, through funding academic positions at universities, through paying for research to be produced, through paying for people to get appointed to certain positions in certain, government agencies and things, to make this kind of argument sound scientific. And it took a long time to mount a successful counterattack to that, because the old kind of crude Keynesian paradigm had to be updated. And the people who'd been trying to update it, who hadn't been listened to, were suddenly kind of left with this task, and everybody else kind of either slunk into the background or just changed ship. And so this kind of goes back to what I was saying before about having one gun in your arsenal. There is a very large, very powerful, very decentralized network of entities. Some people acting in very good faith with pure intentions, but are just part of this whole ecosystem, who are pushing a certain framework for how the economy works. And as long as those people are in power, without some form of discrediting like that was provided by the '08 crisis, it's very, very hard to counteract them, because they're not going to let you in. They're not going to validate what you're saying. So it's sort of like saying, well, I've got these ideas, but the entire economist profession doesn't believe in them. You sound like somebody who believes in flat earth theory or anti-vaxxer theory or something. You're sort of saying, well, what I know is true, even though 98% of the scientific consensus is against me. And so the real political challenge is how you manufacture scientific consensus, or the perception of scientific consensus. And that's a very, sort of nuanced, long, slow game. And this is what I meant about interests. So just to give an example from my world as a lawyer, there is a movement called the Law and Economics movement. And it was founded by there were progressive versions of it in earlier iterations during World War I and II, but there were people who came in the 50s and 60s and 70s. People like Richard Posner in particular is a sort of seen to be one of the figureheads of the movement, who said the best thing that the court system can do is maximize economic efficiency and leave the redistributive questions to the legislature, because redistributive questions are much more political, whereas the court's just trying to make the system work. So why don't we make decisions about interpreting the law, whether it's contract or property or whatever, in such a way as to maximize efficiency, and then we grow the pie, and then it's up to the public through democracy to work out how to redistribute the pie. That was their thinking. And if you stop for a moment and reflect, that sounds very similar to what people were saying with regards to the Treasury and the central bank. Let the central bank focus on growth, on maximum output and stable prices, and then let the Treasury and the fiscal policy sort of rob Peter to pay Paul or whatever. And so both of those narratives served to depoliticize or distract attention away from certain spheres of political contestation, namely the judiciary and the central bank. And so what it was able to do was to say sort of, this is all objective science here. The messy political questions, you want the room down the hall. We're just men of science in here. Of course, everybody in that room happened to be, a white man with largely reactionary views, but that's irrelevant. We, the politics are down the road. And so that move is beneficial for the entities that are more likely to have access to those rooms and those institutions, because it takes the political pressure off. If you said, hey, the central bank is doing something bad, or the central bank's policies are hurting people, the response is, no, we're just maximizing output. If you have a problem with distribution, go take that up with fiscal policy. And the courts were able to say the same thing. Our decisions are just maximizing economic efficiency. If you think that leads to an unjust outcome, then go deal with that by changing the law. And so both of those situations are attempts by certain interests to win entire spaces and keep control of them. And that requires making scientific their point of view and delegitimizing is not just left wing, but fundamentally anti-scientific, their opponents' views.
So we're up on to the end of the hour here, and one of the things I want to close with is, and I'm just going to be honest. First things first, you have this conference coming up, the Worldwide MMT Conference in UMKC. I believe it's September 21st through the 24th. And if it's okay for me to say, I'm just extremely excited that I'll get to be able to go and actually be a part of that in some small fashion, because this means so much to me. I'm ever so grateful that I'll be able to participate. But tell the folks what is going on, what it's all about, how it came to be, and how they might be able to attend if they would like.
Yeah, well, I believe registration is online open right now at mmtconference.org. And I highly encourage anyone that's interested in these ideas to attend. This isn't a conference only open to insiders. It's not designed to be only for academics. This is really an attempt to sort of, a sort of debutante ball, to sort of reintroduce MMT to the world. Obviously, it's been around for 20 years, but the political events of the last 18 months have around the world changed a lot of people's starting baseline. So MMT is in a different place than it was 18 months ago. And this is, not least because Stephanie Kelton, who is at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and is one of the conveners of the conference, spent a year, first as the chief economist for the Democratic Party in the Senate Budget Committee, and then as Bernie Sanders' chief economic advisor. So in part, this is a sort of Mr. Smith goes to Washington and come back moment, and to the extent that from everything that I've heard, she had people had an excellent time interacting with her on the Hill. She had a very good reputation. Everybody, she did an amazing job, being accessible and being, conveying these ideas with integrity without sort of being seen as a tin hat ideologue. That this is a moment that sort of a lot of these ideas time has come, and people are starting to take these ideas much more seriously, both in the halls of power and around the world. So, this is a conference that's being co-organized by a range of different organizations. I won't list them all, but you can see them on the website, and my organization, the Modern Money Network, is part of that. So we're trying to bring to the table what we see as sort of interesting ways to develop MMT ideas and move them forward, and to discuss the practicalities of making these ideas policy and sort of hegemonic discourse. But it's also going to be a chance for everybody to meet each other. This is what I was saying before, about everybody's got their bit to contribute. This isn't a sort of thanks, we'll take it from here, or all we want is your money, go away kind of thing. Although, if you've got donations to make, please do so. We'd love some donations on the MMM website. But if you have your time to contribute, if you have just your enthusiasm and willingness to talk about these ideas with other people, if you have your personal experience and story to share, if you've just got a certain kind of expertise with audiovisual equipment, or, writing copy or coding or whatever it is, whatever kind of skills that may be useful, or a spare car or a spare room that you can put people up if they're visiting a certain town or something, or even you want to host an event at your local church or Rotary Club or something, any way that you can contribute, this is another avenue to come and meet people and to talk about ways to do that together, and to meet the people who are the sort of, elders in this community, because they are very approachable. They are committed to the same things that you are. And I think that having a chance to humanize these names that you see on the internet is very healthy. I first came to this stuff via the internet, but I didn't really start my journey to build the Modern Money Network until I ended up at a lunch table at a conference with Pavlina Chernova at a Minsky conference at the Ford Foundation in New York City. And so I got to meet her in person. I sort of said, wow, this is so amazing to meet someone that I, spent so long reading online. So we've all had that kind of moment where the distance between the MMT community and your sort of computer screen gets a lot smaller. And this is one of those opportunities to do that. So I highly encourage people who are able to attend in any way, or if not able to attend, to participate via the live stream, to do so. But to realize that the point of conferences is to make that human connection.
I love it. We Real Progressives, obviously, this is the foundation of what we do, because our goal is ultimately to enact a broad sweeping progressive agenda, but more importantly, to enable the grassroots to not cower in fear when people say things, but to speak with conviction and boldness and be able to activate and raise the roof and put pressure, put upward pressure on the decision makers to change the orthodoxy. And so for me, this is a really important opportunity for us to make connections, to network, to do all the things you said. But really, quite frankly, I really want to make this, I want to be a part of the vanguard that makes this the new orthodoxy. So it's extremely exciting to me to even be a part of it in any way, shape, or form. So with that,
I mean, just on that 1 second quickly,
sure.
You're seeing people fight to make new orthodoxies in a whole range of areas right now. You know, the LGBTQ movement around the world has made acceptance of LGBTQ rights something that went from being a fringe position to something that is now sort of the accepted starting point of the conversation. And that was within a matter of decades. In the US right now, you're seeing a similar push for a universal right to healthcare. And so the importance of changing the baseline is something that throughout history has really materially improved people's lives. This isn't just a matter of changing sort of language. It's a matter of the difference between thinking that slavery is good and slavery is bad, or that democracy is good versus aristocracy. You know, this is how we change society from the core social contract upwards.
I love it. I love it. All right, sir. With that, I'm going to go ahead and put us out. Say thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Steve.
And, I really, really want you to know how important you guys are to our movement and how grateful we are for the partnership and friendship and your availability. It really means a lot to us, Rohan. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you too. It's great to see someone working so hard every day, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Take it easy.
Thank you, sir. Have a good night, buddy. Thank you all. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you soon.